Hello, and welcome to the latest presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday lecture series. I'm Anita Warren with the Friends of History and will serve as your host today. Today's lecture is Diary of Women Pioneers by our speaker, Norma Libman. What was it like for a woman to travel west? These monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History of the New Mexico History Museum and through donations from our audience. These funds go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, New Mexico History Museum programs and exhibits. Should you wish to donate, please go to our website shown here and click on the donate button at the top of that page. And now, let's meet today's speaker. Norma Libman is an award-winning author, journalist, and educator. Her areas of concentration are crypto-Jews and conversos, Chinese women writers of Nushu, and Diaries of Women Pioneers. She has published more than 500 articles in newspapers and other publications nationwide. She has degrees in education and literature and has done extensive research in the area of women's writings and their contributions to the preservation of their various cultures. She is also the author of 3 award-winning books, excerpts of which can be read at her website, normalibman.com. Today, Norma will be speaking about Diaries of Women Pioneers. The journey west was perilous and exciting. The journals kept by women pioneers provide details that enrich our understanding of the experience in a way that differs from and enhances the information we get from the writings of the men. The women prepared the meals, healed the sick, kept track of the children, counted the dead and the miles traveled, and drove the wagons if their husbands were lost along the way. In this lecture, Norma examines the writings of these women pioneers and reveals behind-the-scenes secrets of the settlement of the West. You will meet a group of hardy and dedicated women, some with familiar names and some you may not know yet. And now I'd like to welcome Norma Libman.
Thank you, Anita, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here and to start by answering a question that I get surprisingly often, which is why spend all this time on women when the men did the interesting stuff? They did the planning, they did the driving of the wagons. And my answer is the men did do interesting stuff. Lewis and Clark are a great example. And they did drive the wagons as when they could. And they did make the plans, but none of it, I can't say that it would never happen without the women. Some did, but the women made a huge, huge difference. And they were more than equal participants. A lot of the information we get that we know, like how many people died along the way, things like that, the women were keeping track of a lot of that information, and the men didn't necessarily have the time for it. So I've put together a lot of excerpts from journals. I'll read very few, but 1 or 2 just to give you a sense of what they sounded like. They vary in quality of writing and knowledge of grammar, this sort of thing. Punctuation, they vary greatly, as you could imagine. Some of the women were well-educated women, some had little or no education, and they did the best they could. Some are really hard to follow because it turns out punctuation is important. So it can be a little bit difficult, but and the other distinction you need to know is that some of these diaries are written along the way, and some were written afterward. And as you can imagine, there's a big difference between them, not only in how clean they are, but also in how immediate they are with their reactions to what is happening, which I'm sure you could understand too. So just to give you an idea of what fell to the women. Now, we said the men did the driving, the men did the planning, and certainly the men would tend to do work like repairing, making repairs on wagons when those things happen. You would expect that sort of thing, anything that needs more strength, perhaps. But the women did everything else. They prepared for the trip, and we're going to start by talking about that. They took care of the children, took care of the older people. Many grandmas and grandpas came along for the trip, not because they wanted to, but because they did not know if their family would ever return east. And in fact, most cases they didn't. And so they didn't want to be left alone in their old age or to die alone. And so they went along, and frequently they did not. They were the ones that had the hardest time making it to the end. And so many died along the way, and many got sick along the way. And that was the women who took care of them, as well as children, keeping track of them, animals, keeping track of them, and healing, giving birth to, helping women give birth. They prepared for everything. And they, just to give you an idea, they sometimes took as long as a year to make these preparations. They often sewed the tents that they were going to use along the way. Little details that you probably never even would think of. It fell to them. And the irony of it is that rarely, especially in the beginning, the early years, rarely did the women even want to go. They went because their husband or their father told them. And we have a lot of journals written by teenage girls, young girls, and they just had no choice. The father decided, the husband decided, and also many women went along as it sounds funny to say this, but it was their honeymoon. They got married the day before leaving, and 20% of the women were pregnant when they started the journey. So there were definitely going to be babies born along the way. So we get the behind the scenes on all of this. For instance, a wagon breaks down. The people went in groups. They did not go out one wagon with one family. You just didn't do that. It was far too dangerous. Wagons would break down. What would happen then? There'd be another, you'd have to combine your goods and your people with somebody else. And how are you going to do that? You're going to have to get rid of some stuff, hopefully not any people, but some stuff. And women had to make those decisions. They had to decide what to keep and what to get rid of. And sometimes, often, in fact, the decision was between the pots and pans or grandma's quilt. And unless you were in a big group, you had a lot of wagons, you were going to have to give something up. And it was hard to give up grandma's quilt. And other family heirlooms, traditional things. But the women made those decisions. The men did not. They just said, get going. And it had to be done quickly too, because the wagon was broken and people couldn't tarry. They generally did about 14 miles a day. And they measured that by a method they had with measuring the wheels and the turns of the wheels. And the women kept track of that too. So the period I'm talking about here is for the most part between 1840 and 1870. And most of that was Mormon Trail, Oregon Trail. The Santa Fe Trail was less written about and less traveled in general. The major push was straight west. Especially during this time period. Later, the Santa Fe Trail came in more, but we'll talk a little bit about it anyways. the primary reasons that people went at all, and you can see these are probably would be of interest to the men in those times. One was to claim land, mainly in Oregon and California. Two was to mine for gold and silver. Three was if they were part of the army. And women traveled with the army as well. They were laundresses. And there's some talk that that might not be the only thing they did. But in general, they were performing the kind of work that the men would not have been doing. There was also a depression in 1837, and so unemployment got to be higher. And honestly, another reason is that people felt too crowded in New York and other places on the East Coast, if you can imagine. And I always like to remind you that these people were direct descendants of the people who came across the Atlantic Ocean on their own, because they had an adventurous spirit. And so maybe that's even an inherited trait, but these people were leaving the United States, going into unknown land. So it would be adventurous people that would be likely to do that. So the way that they started the trip, for the most part, was that they met groups of people at what they called the jumping off places. Those were the towns along the Missouri River between St. Joseph and Council Bluffs. And families would go there and meet, either by accident or on purpose, other families and friends. And they would have several, 2 or 3 or 4, depending how big a group, wagon in each little mini group, if you will, and they'd be part of a bigger group. And some of the groups had hired guides, but not all. But that was a business, guiding groups west and then returning and getting another group. I don't know how many trips like that they could make, but there was a business. And they would leave, there were guidebooks at that time. If you go at the beginning, 1840, guidebooks weren't terribly accurate. That's how the Donner Party got in trouble. We'll talk about them later. But later, the guidebooks got better too, but they were never totally accurate. There were just too many unknowns along the way. But an important thing that they were uneasy about, sort of unknown about, was how long the trip would take. And the people who started in the early years were given to believe the trip was going to take 3 to 6 months. Actually, it took more like 6 to 9 months. They couldn't leave until the spring rains were kind of over, and because until then the ground was too soft, and the wagons could get stuck in the mud, and that was very bad. Remember, they weren't on any kind of paved areas. So they had to wait for the spring rains to be over and the ground to dry, and then they would go and they would bring with them seeds to plant in the fall for the winter. But frequently they did not get to California in time to plant for the winter. So we'll also talk later, just briefly, about what they found when they got there. It was very often not what they expected, and timing was a big part of that. So that was one major problem. Also, they walked most of the way, and the reason for that is that the wagons could get as hot as 110 degrees in the summer, in the middle of the day. They also had to keep their chickens, if they brought any, and most of them did, in the wagons. They had to keep baby animals that were born, oxen, mostly is what they took, not horses so much. But they couldn't walk for the first couple days. And so, I mean, they could walk, but they couldn't manage a walk like that. So they would be kept in the wagon. Anyone who was sick would be in the wagon. And that was often a place for grandma, grandpa, or anyone who couldn't walk for whatever reason. They'd have to be in the wagon. So most people were walking. And the amazing, one of the amazing things is to read these women who were pregnant and walked all that way. And my favorite comment by any diary anywhere is a woman who described the approximately 14 miles of walking, the breakfast before they left, the lunch when they stopped in midday for the lunch, and the women are cooking these meals, and then dinner. And then this woman says, as just as an aside, baked a cherry pie for dinner. And I just thought to myself, boy, if I'd gone to the grocery store that day, I probably wouldn't be up for baking a cherry pie. But they did it, and it's just remarkable. I've had people ask me how were they different from us, and I said they weren't different from us. They just did what they had to do, and I think we could assume we could do it too if we had to, but we never did. So, but I think we could. So here's a list of women's chores from one person's diary: cooking and baking, washing clothes, driving the teams when necessary. That would be that the husband is lost or sick. Collecting wood, buffalo chips, which is oxen dung, or weeds for fires, collecting wild berries, watching and caring for well, sick, and irritable children, giving birth, often without help, or being the helper. The men's diaries, just for comparison, mostly speak about the excitement of the journey and the planning. Women's diaries speak of fear and exhaustion a lot. And when you remember that this wasn't even their idea of something they wanted to do, it's even more amazing. As I said, 1 out of 5 women were pregnant when they started the journey, and almost all of them had children already to take care of, and unless they were among the ones that got married in order to go on the trip. Many women also got pregnant along the way. Nobody talks about how this happened. And since they slept in the outdoors for the most part, well, let's just say that it seems like it would be unlikely that it would happen very much, but it did. It happened a lot. The women who traveled alone were, as I said, the laundresses with the army, teachers, and health seekers is a phrase they used to describe them. People who thought it would be healthier out in the West, which they probably were right about in many cases. There had been a cholera epidemic around the beginning of this time, and people were also going to escape that. If a husband was lost, a woman could stake her claim on her own. And here's a picture of a woman who lost her husband along the way, continued the trip on her own, driving her wagon. And when she arrived in what I believe was part of Colorado, she did not go all the way to the West Coast, and a lot of people didn't, even though they thought they would in the beginning. She built her own house, and I'm sure she had some help. And so here you see a gentleman giving her the deed to that house, and you can see the little house behind her and what she built. I also would suggest you notice what she's wearing. This is really important. You would think that these women, with all the work they had to do, and so much of it physical work outdoors, would have taken to wearing pants, but they did not. And this is one of the most interesting things to me. Number one, they stayed wearing their skirts. Second, they actually made the skirts a little bit shorter than what was fashionable, so that they wouldn't be all getting in the mud all the time. And they put little weights in the hems so they would stay down and they wouldn't blow up in the wind. But after much reading, I formed I didn't do it all on my own, but I realized that there was a really good reason for keeping the skirts. And if you've ever driven through Kansas or Nebraska, you know how barren and open and wide it can be in many parts of those states. Not a lot of trees. We have an issue about going to the bathroom. And what was very common for women was for 3 women to go out away from where the wagons have stopped. And 2 would hold up those skirts, if you can picture that, looking at her skirt there. They would hold up 2 of them hold up the skirts to form a curtain. And the 3rd woman could go to the bathroom, and then they behind those skirts, and then they would switch places and they would all get their turn. So it was very practical to keep the skirts, to have them, and they did. I won't say there's never a woman who wore pants, but I haven't seen any pictures of them. You hear a lot about the issue of disease, and that's worth a mention. The kinds of disease, besides cholera, which some of them when they left, they were trying to escape cholera, but they had it already. Other diseases that people traveled with: typhoid, mountain fever, measles, dysentery. And they died of these diseases sometimes, and they were buried. And they attempted to bury them 6 feet, but they couldn't always take the time to do it. And as they traveled along, we know that they didn't, because women reported that they saw graves dug up, often by animals. They could tell if they'd been dug up by animals, because then they would find bones around them. Or sometimes they were, often too, I shouldn't say sometimes, by native people. After these groups had been coming through for a few years, they caught on that they could find clothes for sure, and sometimes other things in the graves. And so they would dig them up, and that's how the disease was spread to the native population. They refer to them always as Indians in the diaries. That's what they were called then. And so I try not to use that too often, but it just comes up. And that's a very important part of the story of these women, because they were the ones that forged connections with the native population. And the primary thing that it was about was herbs and medicinal plants for medicine for illnesses. And when they left their homes, they took with them plants and things that they could use, that they were accustomed to using to treat illnesses. And lo and behold, they found out those plants weren't growing everywhere they were going. And so some things they had, like they used turpentine as an ingredient in cough medicine. So some things were okay, but others, just once they ran out, they couldn't get any more. The native people came out, and they showed the women, they were friendly in the beginning. After a while, they weren't so friendly. But if you can imagine all these people tramping through where you live, if you think of the human waste alone, this would not be welcome after a while. But in the beginning, they were quite welcoming. And they explained, what plants out here can do what. And it was very important, very critical. Is an interesting sideline about that. the native culture was very much similar to many other parts of the world. I think of Asia in particular, but lots of parts where when you meet somebody, when you come to where they live, or you meet them, you bring a gift. And the native women would often bring something they baked, or sometimes jewelry, and they would give it to the women in the wagon train. And then they would hold out their hand for their gift, because they assumed that anyone coming to visit would brought a gift. And of course, that wasn't part of the culture of the Europeans. And so they didn't have a gift. And so they interpreted what this holding out their hand on the part of the native women, that they wanted their gift back. Because it didn't occur to them that they thought that they would bring a gift. And that is where the phrase, the expression Indian givers comes from. They thought that these people gave them a gift and then wanted it back. So that's the origin of that. This is a quote from Walter Prescott Webb, who wrote The Great Plains in 1931, in reference to the fact that the women marked, at the end of the day, they would say how many miles they went, some of the women, how many miles they went and how many graves they passed. And he says that a government report from the Times estimated that each mile of the 2,000-mile journey cost 17 lives. A total of 34,000 lives were lost. And 2,000 miles is an estimate to, depending where they ended up. And many, many people stopped along the way and didn't go the whole way as far as they thought they were going to go in the beginning. And a very common place to stop was Denver, because it was kind of settled, especially as we got along in time. As far as the people who died on the trail, mostly from illness, there were some murders. There were women who died in about the same numbers as men. From 1859 to 1860, the death rate for women was 22% higher than men, including violent deaths. And in an 1865 study of mortality rates of women between the ages of 20 and 50 were 50% higher than men, while back in the United States, it was about the same. So I've never found any particular explanation for that. I simply don't know. There may be, but I haven't encountered anything, except to say, of course, it would suggest that life was harder on women than it was on men in this journey. And when you think of all the pitfalls, such as having babies and all of that, that is the probable answer. There may be some other reasons as well. So the preparation for the journey. They had guidebooks. As I said, the early ones were not always very accurate. But here's one in particular that suggested that you would need the following items. Food, you would need flour, sugar, rice, coffee, bacon, salt, vinegar, dried fruit, and dried meats. You would need cooking utensils, clothing, cloth, sewing supplies, linens, quilts, farming tools, wash tubs, books, writing material, furniture, seeds, dishes, and sentimental items of all sorts. And as I said, they also had to make the tents if they were going to use tents. Some just slept out in the open. Some might have slept in the wagons, but not very much. That was really the place where most of them had chickens or animals of some sort. I'm going to read this particular one, and it's from a book called One Woman's West. This particular one was written afterward. And the woman who wrote this was 13 at the time that they were preparing for the trip. And this was a trip that the father and husband wanted to take. And she writes this after they are settled. I was 13 years old now, and I had many school friends who were dear to me. They came to see me often and watched the preparations which were being made. Bolts of heavy canvas were in the house being measured off for the 4 immense wagon covers. Also, the great tent was cut out and a dozen or more working on it. Dozens of garments of all sizes and colors were in progress. For more than a year, the sewing was being done, all by hand. Many neighbors came to the sewing bees. How they would talk and cry over their sewing, saying we would all surely be lost crossing the plains. When the time drew near for us to be off, our home was sold and the household furniture disposed of. Many family relics which we could not take along were given to friends. Farewell sermons were preached and prayers offered for our safety. Friends came from afar to say goodbye. The great white tent stood in the yard, a wonder to old and young. The 4 covered wagons were loaded with the supplies ready to roll out on the long journey. So that's something we don't think about too often. The preparation was a lot. There was a book that was very popular called The Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, which came out in 1845. And this one gave a little bit more specific. This is what they recommended: 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of coffee, 20 pounds of sugar, 10 pounds of salt per person. Also, chipped beef, tea, rice, dried beans, dried fruit, baking soda, vinegar, pickles, mustard, tallow, kettle, fry pan, coffee pot, tin plates, cups, knives, forks, rifles, powder, lead, and shot. The guidebook recommended that should cost between $300 and $600, depending on what the family already had. And it also recommended cash for the following items along the way. One, for the jumping off places. So in other words, they might spend some weeks in the jumping off places before they got the whole group together. Communication would not be anywhere near what we're used to today. They also would need cash to replace stores that were used up, and also to buy replacements for wagon parts and to pay people to fix the wagons if there wasn't somebody to do it. Wagons broke down all the time. And to pay the ferrymen who took them across rivers, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. And also to buy whatever they would need to get through the winter and the spring in the new land where they were. And they generally had no idea how much they were going to need, because they, as I said, they thought they'd plant in fall planting, and they usually couldn't. So they needed a fair amount of money, and a lot of people really just gave up if things got bad. And when they came to a fairly civilized place like Denver, they would stay. So sometimes also they had the opportunity to get to stay with a family, some farmers along the way, often people who didn't, who had come out the same way themselves, would put them up for a day or two or give them a chance to rest, but there was no way to know in advance if that was going to happen. So they had a journey that was filled with unexpected things. When you think how we plan a trip, they really, even the planning they did was usually not adequate. And a lot of things can go wrong with a lot of people. Just to give you an example of a very common thing, which is when I mentioned a wagon would break down and they'd have to abandon it along the way. Nobody could fix it. It was beyond fixing whatever was the problem. They'd have to discard some things. There were people who traveled behind wagon trains just for the purpose of picking up things that were being abandoned along the roadside. And that could be parts, wagon parts, or anything from inside the wagon, anything they were taking with. It was, I've never read of an instance where it was food. They never would abandon the food, but they did have to abandon other things, particularly family heirlooms that they wanted to keep. Those had to go sometimes. And you might give up half your pots and pans and whatever you had to do, but they didn't give up food. They found a way to keep the food. There's one woman that I like to mention because she is an example of the kind of thing that women encountered. Her name is Patty Sessions. You may have heard of her. She was a famous midwife, a Mormon woman who went from Illinois to Salt Lake City. And she is reputed, this did not happen just on the trip, but she's reputed to have delivered 3,977 babies. I don't know how many were on the trip. She drove a 4-ox team herself most of the way in a party of 73 wagons. And if you look, I have a picture here of a group coming through a town. And you can see this is a sort of a medium-sized wagon group, and they're in a very primitive looking town. And they would come in and they would just buy things and whatever they could do when they got to a town. They usually didn't know when they would get to a town. Sometimes they did. Notes were left on trees, sometimes with suggestions of things that coming up. They weren't always accurate either. So she was in a party of 73 wagons, and that would be sort of, this is what a party like that would look like coming into a town. She had 2 living sons and daughters. 5 other children died of illness. She was in her 50s when she made the overland trip, and her husband, David Sessions, died on the trail. She remarried a man named John Perry, who was also a Mormon, and he took a second wife, and she, Patty Sessions, delivered that wife's babies. And she outlived him also and died in 1892 at the age of 97. So if you were strong, this did not do you in. You would have you could survive. And by the way, just incidentally, animals gave birth too, and they needed help sometimes. So the women also had to do that. In the diaries, the women almost never mention that they're pregnant. And these are some of the most fascinating ones to read, and because you never know it's coming. And they can go on and describe days and days of rigorous travel and then just mention that they had a baby. So it certainly seems that being pregnant didn't slow anybody down. I suppose it must have in some instances, but basically it didn't seem to. I'm going to read you one little short piece from a woman named Amelia Stewart. She tells, and I'll just give you an idea of these, not read all of it, about her trip day to day. She has the date and the day of the week. For instance, Monday, September 5th, passed a sleepless night last night as a good many of the Indians camped around us were drunk and noisy and kept up a continual racket, which made all hands uneasy and kept our poor dog on the watch all night. And by the way, it was not always necessarily the native people who were doing this. Their own compatriots were often drunk and noisy or argumentative. So it could be anything. I say poor dog because he is nearly worn out with traveling through the day and should rest at night, but he never can. Doubtless they would have done, the Indians, as she calls them, would have done some mischief, but for him. So you have some stereotypical ideas as well. And again, these people were intruders. So on Thursday, September 7th, Wednesday, she keeps blank, but she marks the date. Then September 8th, she says, traveled 14 miles off over the worst road that was ever made, up and down, very steep, rough and rocky hills, through mud holes, twisting and winding round stumps, longs, and fallen trees. This is an example, by the way, of a woman who writes very well. Now we are on the end of a log, now over a big root of a tree, now bounced down in a mud hole, then bang goes the other side of the wagon, and woe to whatever is inside. There is very little chance to turn out of this road on account of timber and fallen trees, for these mountains are a dense forest of pine, fir, white cedar, or redwood. On and on. The next day came 8.5 miles, crossed Sandy 4 times. That's river. And we're going to talk about the rivers in a minute. And the next day, it would be useless for me with my pencil to describe the awful road we have just passed over. Let fancy picture a train of wagons and cattle passing through a crooked chimney, and we have Big Laurel Hill. After ascending several bad hills, one called Laurel Hill, which I thought to be as bad as could be, but in reality it was nothing to this last big one called Big Laurel. It is something more than half-mile long, very rocky all the way, quite steep, winding, sidling, deep down, slippery and muddy, made so by a spring running the entire length of the road. Folks hurrying back and forth, cattle straining, on and on. Horrible, horrible trip. And you've probably seen some of these places. If you read any of these, you will probably recognize, I mean, their description of Yellowstone Park, even though they don't call it that, you can tell that that's what it is. Very interesting. By September 13th, she says, ascended 3 steep, muddy hills this morning, drove over some muddy, miry ground and through mud holes, and have just halted at the first farm to noon and rest a while, and buy feed for the stock. Paid $1.50 per hundred for hay. Price of fresh beef 16 and 18 cents per pound. Butter ditto. $1 for eggs. A dozen eggs. Onions $4 and $5 a bushel. All too dear for poor folks. So we have treated ourselves to some small turnips at the rate of 25 cents per dozen. She goes on for 3 more days. And then on Friday, September 17th, says, in camp yet, still raining, noon, it is cleared off and we're all ready for a start again for some places we don't know where. A few days later, my 8th child was born. After this, we picked up and ferried across the Columbia River, utilizing skiff, canoes, and flatboats, etc., etc. That's it, 1 sentence. That's what you got. Now, crossing the rivers is a very big deal. And I just want to get to this. I have, okay, I'm sorry. I want to tell you one other thing first, and then we'll cross the river. They did stop for all their meals together. They'd stop for lunch and stay over a bit if it was very hot before going out again. They'd have dinner together. And then in the morning, they'd have breakfast together before they left. And during these times, there was all sorts of entertainment. There would be singing, there would be playing of banjos and what have you. And there would be meetings of sorts. Sometimes there were problems to consider, some issues with people, whatever it would be. And they, some of the descriptions I've read of these meetings, I think of, they're sort of like a bad condo meeting, you know, even though it was a moving condo, but they had the same kind of problems, you know, this neighbor was doing this, whatever. And they had trouble, they had fights among themselves. They could blame it all on the native population if they wanted to, but they started plenty of their own arguments and fights too. So I want to read a description. First of all, here is, I'm sorry, let me just get to the right one. Okay. So here is just an example of what they might have encountered from neighboring wagon travelers. And this particular one is written by a person who had used no punctuation, so I do the best I can. This is also dated on September 15th, but this is another group. Laid by this morning, one company moved on except one family. The woman got mad and would not budge nor let the children. He had his cattle hitched on for 3 hours and coaxing her to go, but she would not stir. I told my husband the circumstance, and him and Adam Polk and Mr. Kimball went, excuse me, and took each one a young one and crammed them in the wagon, and her husband drove off and left her sitting. She got up, took the back track, traveled out of sight, cut across, overtook her husband. Meantime, he sent his boy back to camp after a horse that he had left. And when she came up, her husband says, "Did you meet John?" "Yes," was the reply, and I picked up a stone and knocked out his brains. Her husband went back to ascertain the truth, and while he was gone, she set one of the wagons on fire, which was loaded with store goods. The cover burnt off and some valuable articles. He saw the flame and came running and put it out, and then mustered spunk enough to give her a good flogging. Her name is Markham. She is cousin to Adam Polk's wife. So these are the kind of incidents. There's tons of them all over. If you look at this next picture, you'll see a group crossing through a river. And this was very perilous journey. But as you can see in the picture, they would line up and they would just go. What they had to do was, most of the time, they went a little bit to one angle and then came back a little bit again and a little to another angle and back again. And they tried somehow, they knew how to do it. They, especially the ones that had guides, were pretty good. But they would have they would pay people who were waiting at the side of the road to lead them across. And some of the horses and oxen, whatever were going, they would get scared. They would stop in their tracks. Then they would start to sink. Sometimes they would turn and try to go back. All kinds of mishaps. And there was a lot of, as they describe it, helloing, people yelling out of terror and urging people to go forward when they stopped and everything. And frequently, because of the way the rivers would wind back and forth, they would have to recross the same river more than once. And sometimes it will come up another day. Here they are crossing the river again because it's made some kind of turn or whatever. And so it was very frustrating and very difficult. That was one of the things they needed money for, because they had to pay these people to help them across. And it was quite a scary proposition. I've never seen a picture that really shows how it would be with a lot of wagons. This is the closest I could ever find to that. But they would, it was really a harrowing part of the journey, for sure. So some of the things that also that would happen is that they would have false alarms. They would get a warning that something was going to happen, and that there were dangerous warring Indians, as they would put it. Sometimes it would be true and sometimes it wouldn't. So these notes, they stuck notes on the trees, were sometimes good and sometimes bad. So I want to give you just an example, two more things that I want to cover. One is an example of what people sometimes found when they got to where they were going. And the other is an example of a trip gone really badly wrong. And I'm actually going to add, before I do that, I'm going to add one more example that I forgot about that I want to. So this is another problem along the way. And this is a woman who she's pretty good, and she's traveled. She's got her own little family that she's traveling with, and her parents are also with them. And so I'm just going to read two parts of this. We had camped in a beautiful valley at the foot of the east side of the Rocky Mountains, and everything seemed peaceful and quiet. And so this is the evening, they've stopped for the evening. Most all the people were gone to bed when the cattle got scared and stampeded, running out at the side where our wagon stood. There were about 400 head, and they made a noise like thunder. It was not quite dark yet, and I got up to get out of the wagon, but in front of our wagon was a mighty torrent of cattle. They had pressed against our wagon till it was turned halfway round. So I sat and waited for the composure of bewilderment, terror, and astonishment. I waited with the composure of bewilderment, terror, and astonishment. Pa had got out and gone I knew not where, so I thought I best stay where I was. When the roaring, surging mass of cattle passed on, then the human element of the disturbance became apparent, and it was no less terrorizing than the other. Such wailings and howlings, especially of some of those would-be brave warriors of the Johnson train, I hope I shall never hear again, for the first impression among them was that the Indians had come sure enough. Men that I should judge had never used the divine name except in profanity were calling earnestly on the Lord for help. And very naturally, I suppose, feeling that he was a long way off, they used the utmost power of their lungs. And the poor women were screaming, and all those poor and whooping coffee children, of whom there were 75 in the Johnson train alone, had to take a turn at coughing. And dogs. This train had evidently started out with the idea that dogs were scarce where they were going, and they had big dogs, little dogs, mother dogs, and their puppies, and dogs of all nondescript varieties, which added not a little to the unearthly racket. So I sat and listened, thinking I would surely hear the traditional war whoop if it were Indians, which I imagine would be even more terrible than this pandemonium. There was little rest for anyone that night, for it required the united efforts of all the men to keep the cattle from running over the corral and destroying everything. When morning came, we were a perplexed and woebegone lot. The Johnson train were clamorous to go on, thinking if they stayed there another night, the Indians would surely massacre us. They could not get the Indian idea out of their heads. Our side was willing to do whatever Deckard advised. He was their paid guide, and he thought it was almost an impossibility to hitch up the wild, frightened steers, so we had better wait till they were pretty well tired out. But before the matter was settled, it became evident that I was in a poor fix to travel. So when our guide learned that, he said that settled the matter. And as far as he was concerned, and anybody that insisted on a woman going on in the fix I was in ought to be hung, and that he would stay with Cooper if no one else did. because she can't say she's pregnant, they just won't say it. So, but that you can sort of guess was the situation. So they stayed on, and and she says that everyone stayed because they were afraid to go alone. So they're all still there together. And she says, as all remained, Deckard recommended the experiment of each man taking his team and caring for it separately through the day, as it might have a tendency to allay their panic. That's their animals. The scheme succeeded admirably all through the day, and the people became cheerful again. At 2 o'clock, a little blue-eyed brother came to our wagon to share the honors and favors with the little black-eyed Belle. And at 5 o'clock, a couple took advantage of the lay-by to get married. And as Grandpa was the only clergyman, they came to his wagon, which was close to ours. I raised my wagon cover a little bit and can virtually claim that I was at the wedding, as I heard the ceremony directly. By sundown, we were all feeling that the calamity was over and we could resume our journey in our usual manner the next day. But alas and alas, when we collected the cattle for the night, they were worse, if possible, than the night before. And it goes on. But that's all the joy of having a baby on the trail, and lots of women did. Lots of women did. So I'm going to read just a little bit about a woman. This is a woman who came a little bit later. She actually came out on a train. She was from Russia, and she was a bride. She was, I don't know, an arranged marriage to marry a man in New York. She came to New York, and they were then to travel to his family, which was already out west, and they were going to join them, and that included his brother and his parents. So she did come out west with him, and they didn't have a home yet, the two of them, so they had to stay with her, as she calls it, her future mother-in-law. They've not actually had the marriage yet. And this is what she found. And I'm so sorry that I'm forgetting if this was, I think it was North Dakota. I'm pretty sure it was North Dakota. Anyways, this is what she writes. And she wrote this later, and she was quite literate. As we approached, my future mother-in-law came out to greet us and ushered us into our separate apartment. I could not believe my eyes. A pit had been, now this woman has not taken a ride across country, and she's come from civilized, I think it was Russia, and civilized New York, and rode out on a train. So that would explain some of her shock. A pit had been scooped out in the center of the dirt floor. This was the private space which we had been promised. Looking about at the people and the space provided for our living, I knew that I was very close to the living level of an animal. As the realization of what I faced grew, my heart turned to stone. There sat Charlie, muddy, tattered, and filthy, an appearance shared by his wife and children. Charlie is her future husband's brother. His 4-year-old boy, cross-eyed with an ever-running nose, wore only a shirt but no pants, while his elderly grandfather was clad only in drawers but also no pants. The shack's furnishings offered no happier view. The single bed was made of rough boards. It had 2 legs on one side. The other side was hammered to the wall. The table was similarly attached to a wall. The bed had neither spring nor mattress, only a spread of straw covered with a sheet. The floor was earthen. I was urged to make myself at home. To think that this was to be my home for even a short time brought bitter tears to my eyes. My fiancé, knowing the dread which gripped me, proposed that we go for another walk. Our footsteps brought us back to our roofless future residence. How forlorn and desolate it looked against the limitless prairie. He explained that there was no money to even buy the nails for a roof. And so they were going to take, it was going to take some time, and she realized she was going to be living with her in-laws for quite some time. At dusk, so they go back to the other cabin. At dusk, the preparations got underway for going to bed. Although there was a lamp in the shanty, there was no kerosene to fuel it, and so the household had been retiring at dusk each day. The arrangements called for me and the mother to occupy the bed while the father, Abe, and his brother Moses were to sleep on the earthen floor. Charlie and Fega's youngest, a boy of 2.5 years, had remained with his grandmother when the others left. The old woman stated that the boy would also occupy the bed. She declared that conditions at Charlie's place were so foul that the child might not survive there, and she intended to keep the boy with her for the time being. In the fading light, I surveyed my dreary surroundings. How could these people, unwashed, with little to eat, dressed in tatters, coarse and illiterate, escape the doom which already held them by the throat? The holes in the walls and the roof of the place were stuffed with bits of paper in hopes of keeping some of the flies out. How could they expect to last out the coming winter in this structure, I wondered. Dear friend, had there been revealed to me at that moment my involvement in the solution of this particular problem, I would have run screaming into the night. She does help them out a lot. But when you think about it, I want you to think back of the woman, excuse me, who built her own house. Where did she live while she was building that house? What kind of a shack, so to speak, was she living in? Okay, so just to end, this is what happened. Everyone went to bed, and returning, everyone went to bed. I hoped for delay in joining them, but 6 people in a 12 by 14 foot space leaves little room to walk about or even stand. Quickly, the darkness became total, and I had no choice but to retire. The boards of the bed, without mattress or spring, were covered with straw, which pricked my skin in the least movement, but did little to ease the hardness of the bare boards. Still, what bothered me the most was occupying the same bed with the old lady, a person whom I had never even known until a few hours ago. I lay as stiff and unmoving as I could while the sound of snoring rose to an ever higher crescendo, until it seemed that the very walls shook. Suddenly, I began to feel quite warm. The little boy had emptied his bladder and quickly followed with a healthy bowel movement. I removed myself as far as possible from these immediate surroundings and gave myself up to utter despair. As the tears ran down my cheeks, I reflected upon the course of my miserable life. So I would just say that you could multiply this many times. Last, I want to tell you about a trip gone wrong. And I want to say, as an aside, that many women, when the trip was over, although few did returnees, some did, and they went on the lecture circuit and they would report on their experiences. And so that is also how we have a lot of information. And it includes some women who were kidnapped by native tribes. And sometimes they were rescued by the army, and sometimes they weren't. And sometimes when they were rescued, they decided not to leave. They had fallen in love with someone and were going to stay with the tribe. All kinds of different things happen to people. It's really quite amazing. The most famous story, unquestionably, and one of the most interesting, is the Donner Party story. I will say there are a couple of names that you might encounter. Josephine Meeker, who was one captured by Indians and then went on a speaking tour. Jeanette Riker was another one. She was traveling with her father and her brothers, and they all disappeared, and she was left alone. She went on the lecture circuit too. This was, this was mostly in the late 1800s. Really. That was a big form of entertainment. The Donner Party was very interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, they were 87 people, and there were several different families mixed in. And the most famous family was the Reed family, because Virginia Reed kept a very good diary and also wrote letters home. And by the way, some of this material is letters that were written home, and those letters were important because often the relatives back home were also intending to go west, and those letters were more useful than many of the guidebooks. This is a picture of Virginia Reed as an older woman. She lived quite a long life, but and she was proud to say that her family ate no human flesh. But at 13, she was keeping a diary. And she said there were 87 people, 9 wagons. They left Springfield, Illinois on April 16th, 1846. So fairly early on. They had servants with them. So some families did travel with servants. I don't know how they got these people to go with them, really, but maybe they had nothing else any better to do. So what happened was that a guidebook had been written, and it told them about a shortcut. And the shortcut is now called the Donner Pass. It wasn't then. It was through the mountains, and it was a good shortcut, except for one thing. They had an early snow, and they got into the mountain pass, and then they got snowed in. Now, the father of this Reed family, first of all, there was a lot of fighting in the original party about whether or not to take the shortcut. This was very common with the so-called men who were doing all the planning. They didn't always agree. So there was a lot of that. And at some point, Virginia Reed's father had gotten into a fight with someone, and he had been exiled. And this was not uncommon. People were killed sometimes if they had committed some crime, and it was decided. This was another common thing that they did, was exile them. And so he left and went straight to California. And that is the only reason probably why some of the Donner Party survived. So the rest of them took the shortcut and got caught in the snow. And Virginia Reed describes her car as a palace car. It had a loft up on top. Their family was obviously well-to-do, and the grandmother stayed up there in the loft. And she was one of those grandmas that came along to die with the family. Very luxuriously furnished inside. It was like a home. They took with them books. The grandma was 75. Grandma Keys, she was also an invalid. She had a large feather bed up there, and she really had a luxurious trip as much as you possibly could because of the loft and the bed and everything. She didn't suffer from all the jerking around, but she did die before the trip was over. She died in May of that year. Anyways, there was no road. The cutoff was no road and not even a trail. So they let their oxen go to search for water, and they never came back. So they lost all their oxen. And they lost a week searching for the oxen, which is also part of the problem. And they eventually had to abandon the 2-story wagon because it was just too big to get through this pass. And so they moved what oxen they had to another wagon. And but most of them died. When they started to get going, it was October, a very early snow, and they were just about out of food by that time. And then they could not get very far. The party of the 15 strongest tried to get through to get help. They couldn't get out. And it was at that point when they saw that they were not going to get any help. Meanwhile, Virginia Reed's father was becoming alarmed in California that they were not appearing, but they didn't know that that was going on. They decided at this point in October to draw straws to see who would be eaten first. And they were actually 150 miles from Sutter's Fort at that time, and they had already traveled 2,500 miles, but they didn't know where they were or how close they were, and it didn't matter, they couldn't get out anyways. Most people, according, most of this information is from Virginia Reed herself, who was 13 years old at the time. Most people got through, but couldn't get a search party together till after the winter. I'm sorry, not most people. Reed got through, as we know that. They did not, the first relief party didn't come through till February 19th. So this had been going on for close to a year already. And that's when they were saved. The ones that had not been eaten were saved. The 80, no, I really can't read this number, but anyways, approximately half of them survived. And the other half either died of natural causes or were actually killed to be eaten. Virginia Reed was very, very proud of the fact that she says, we were the only family that ate no human flesh. And they killed their dog. They killed the couple oxen that they had, but they ate no human flesh, and they all survived. Virginia Reed died in Los Angeles in 1921 at the age of 87. She had married a man named John Murphy, who was a real estate salesman, and she took over his business when he died. So she became a real estate salesman. And I want to close by just reading a little excerpt from a letter she wrote to her cousin talking about this experience. And she wrote 2 letters to her cousin who lived in California. And she writes, so I'm sure I'm reading the right part of it. Last minute. Okay, so she writes about all of this stuff that I have told you comes from her description. And she closes her letter by saying to her cousin Mary, "Oh, Mary, I have not wrote you half of the trouble we have had, but I have," she, by the way, did not have an education, at least not at the time she wrote this, "but I have wrote you enough to let you know that you don't know what trouble is. But thank the good God we have all got through, and the only family that did not eat human flesh. We have left everything, but I don't care for that. We have got through. But don't let this letter dishearten anybody, and never take no cutoffs, and hurry along as fast as you can." Very sage advice. I have one picture here that I would like to show you, which shows a group family resting at midday. And you can see that, I mean, this was a happy time and a relaxed time. And this is how they look. And this is how most of them looked. Even if they had money, when they went out and had a lot of supplies. It wasn't long before they looked pretty much like this family does. So they were they look worn out, is what I'd say, and I'm sure that they were. On the other hand, and I'll show you one more picture, Susan Shelby McGuffin, she went down the Santa Fe Trail, and she looked great, as you can see her picture, but she was very well to do. She had servants with her, as some did, and she talks about having her hens, her chickens with her, but that was actually pretty common. That wasn't she wasn't the only one to have that, but she did have servants who cooked for her. So there's a wide discrepancy, but by the end of the trip, everybody was pretty much reduced to just getting by. So the advice is don't take no shortcuts and hurry as fast as you can. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow. Thank you very much, Norma. Those were quite incredible stories. And what an adventure for the ages. And the youngsters writing diaries. That's incredible. How about a few questions?
Absolutely.
Of the trails, the Mormon Trail, the California Trail, the Oregon Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail, which one of the trails was actually the most arduous and dangerous? Or were they all basically the same?
Well, they were all dangerous. They were. The Santa Fe Trail is the trail that, although it's the closest to us in interest, it's the one I found the least about. And when I first started to do the research, I didn't even know about Susan Shelby McGuffin. That came along later, but the Santa Fe Trail was probably the easiest, is what I would think. It was more of a family trail and more of a business trail. And I think in general, now she went all the way down to Mexico, but I think it was somewhat shorter too. I'm not sure, but the other three I think were equally rigorous, and this one was just not too far behind really at all. This was a rough way to travel.
Well, yeah, the Santa Fe Trail seems to be the shortest. It was only about 869 miles. So compared to the 2,000 plus for the Oregon or the Mormon or the California Trail, it was probably a piece of cake compared to everything else.
Well, it was, and it was also less difficult terrain than when you were going through the others.
Okay.
The west, west of Colorado, it was, a lot more rivers, a lot more steep, this one woman's description of going up and down, if you can imagine it, with those wagons with no springs. So I think that I would go out on a limb and say that I think the Santa Fe was the physically easiest one for a lot of reasons.
Probably. So for the Santa Fe Trail, the first people that came down the Santa Fe Trail used mule trains before they got into wagons. Did the women join the early mule trains, or did they wait only until wagons were used?
Well, there were far fewer women on the Santa Fe Trail than on the other trails. I would never say that there were no women on the mule trains, because I'm sure there were, but I've not seen any diaries from any that came across that way. And later, when they had the wagons, and even getting in, like this one woman who stayed with her in-laws for a while, they even were starting to come by train a little bit. So it was But the Santa Fe Trail was started out mostly, it was businessmen. I'm calling them
Yeah.
businessmen, but the men who had come from Europe, and they had started their with their carts and all of this selling, and then they realized there was opportunity out west, and they came, and they when they got to Santa Fe, they were welcomed there as businessmen. There was a lot of opportunity to start business, and they did, and they started a lot of successful business, some that last to this day, as we know.
Looking and reflecting back on all the diaries that you've read and researched, what was the most surprising revelation about traveling west the women wrote about in their diaries, other than maybe having to have two ladies hold their skirts up so they could go to the bathroom?
Well, now wait a minute. Surprising to me or surprising to them?
Surprise. I would say surprising to you and also surprising to the women.
Okay. Well, first of all, they were very unprepared for the fact that all the stuff they knew about healing and curing diseases, that anything that was dependent upon crops was out the window. That was a big surprise. And so they were very indebted to that. Was one of the reasons why they forged such good relationships with the native population, and they were very helpful to them. So that was one surprise. The other surprise, and I never thought about this, so I guess I could say it was surprising to me too. There was a lot of mental illness and anguish that maybe some of these people started out not too stable, but there was a lot. And there were women who took to their beds in the wagon and didn't come out for months. The young girl who wrote back later, the first thing I read about getting prepared, her mother had what we would probably call a nervous breakdown, and she was in the wagon for a couple of months and had to be taken care of totally. And then, according to what she writes, she got better and she was okay. The men handled that kind of issue differently. They walked away and you never saw them again. Sometimes you heard a gunshot, sometimes you didn't. But the women took to being in the wagon. But there was a lot of it. There was really a lot of it. And you could see in that description about the woman who that went on, she did more stuff than that, that the husband, she set the wagons on fire. And so these people were, maybe in normal circumstances, it would have never come to that. But a lot of people just were not emotionally able to deal with what this was. If you could just imagine yourself on a 9-month crib.
That's
With
amazing.
these conditions and traveling with people that many of them, many of them you might not like. And also some of the women forged very close friendships with other women in the same wagon train. And then when they got to their destination, they were separated by their husbands who went in different directions and couldn't have cared less. So then they lost those friendships and had to start anew again actually over some time I got almost more interested in what happened when they settled, because there are some horrible stories there. So yeah, I think the mental stuff was something I never thought about it, and I don't think most of them saw that coming either.
Well, Norma, thank you so very much for this absolutely fascinating look into the lives of women along the various trails through their own words. As you know, this lecture is pre-recorded, so our audience is not able to ask you questions in real time. So we'd like to direct them to your website, normalibman.com, to send their questions to you. Norma, do you have any final comments before we wrap up today?
Well, I would just say that There are many, many, many diaries now available. They're being found all the time in people's attics and whatnot. And now that people can self-publish to a greater extent than maybe 20, 30 years ago or whatever, when the interest first started, get out there, and I'm sure there's plenty in your library, as I know there are plenty in the stores, and read them and take a look first. Some are hard to read because they're really rough, in the no punctuation kind of thing, and see what you feel up to. But no matter what, they're so interesting. They really are.
Well, thank you again, Norma. This was most interesting.
Thank you and for inviting me. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. And for our audience, in closing, a reminder to visit our webpage of friendsofhistorynm.org, where you can rewatch Norma's lecture and other Friends of History First Wednesday lectures covering a wide range of topics about New Mexico and Southwestern history. Click on the lecture series link at the top of that page, then go to past lectures to see the list. If you wish to learn more about our upcoming lectures or more broadly about the Friends of History, we encourage you to join our mailing list by emailing us at nmhmfriendsofhistory@gmail.com. And finally, we request that you consider making a donation to the Friends of History through our webpage so the Friends of History can continue to support programs at the New Mexico History Museum. And thank you to all of you who have been contributing to Friends of History over the last several years. We look forward to seeing you all in the months ahead. Thank you, and goodbye for now.